Let's be a little more concrete, and I want to just give you an example of what I mean by this. You know, and in the literature, we talk about these spirits as what we call the incubi and the succubi. The spirit that lies in the body or lies on the body, the incubus, and the one that lies under the spirit, the succubus. When we talk about this spirit, though, that possesses us, when we talk about this spirit that the European implanted in us in terms of the language, in terms of the food, in terms of the religion, in terms of the values, in terms of the social relations, in terms of the name, we are talking about a spirit that's just not a spookish entity in ourselves. It actually incarnates in us. What do we talk when we talk about incarnate? We are dealing with the Latin root carnes, which has to do with what? Meat, flesh. In other words, the spirit comes to dwell in our very flesh and comes to sculpt our very bodies. And therefore, the spirit is a physical thing as much as it is a psychological thing. The bodies that we have tonight, ladies and gentlemen, are bodies that have been created by the European experience and are not our natural bodies as African people. Just as the surface of our bodies reflect the influence of another people, the very internal nature and the physiology of our bodies reflect those people as well. That's why when you get rid of them, you're going to have a healing experience. And your whole body will change. I've read some of this before, but let me read it again, I think, in this context. This is most dramatic, and the things I'm talking about are most dramatic when we study the so-called multiple personality. And let me read you a description here that was printed in the Times. And those who might be familiar with it, indulge me here, because I think it points out to something. It begins, when Timmy drinks orange juice, he has no problem. But Timmy's just one of close to a dozen personalities who alternate control over a patient with multiple personality disorder. And if those other personalities drink orange juice, the result is a case of hives. What are we saying here? We got one body, but depending on what consciousness possesses that body will react to the drinking of orange juice with or without hives. It will break out in blisters. So if it drinks orange juice when one of the other personalities is possessing it, welts and hives will break out right there. If Timmy comes back, if the new consciousness comes back and takes over that body, the hives will disappear almost on the moment. In other words, then, there's a different body for a different consciousness. It goes on to say then that medical disorders are found to differ from one sub-personality to another. In other words, even though these so-called personalities possess the same so-called body, each personality has a different order of illnesses associated with it. Each personality is vulnerable to a particular type of ailment, one way or the other. So what are we talking about? We are saying that each consciousness, which is represented by each personality, creates its own body, creates its own physiology, and thereby creates its own vulnerability to various ailments and so forth. You see, you get people in medical school who try to teach you that disease only occurs as a result of some kind of viral syndrome or some kind of entry into the body of some bacteria or other thing, and certainly that is a part of it, and certainly there's reality there. But the body must interact with the viruses and must interact with the disease entity. And this is what we talk about when we talk about the immune system. That health is not necessarily the absence of the disease, but the capacity of the body to resist the disease, to stand up against the disease. And so consequently then, when these bodies are taken over by different personalities, these personalities apparently change the nature of the immune system of those bodies, making them vulnerable to diseases when one personality is present and not so when another is present. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, then, that the nature of the consciousness which possesses us as persons will to a degree determine the illnesses to which we are vulnerable as a person and as people. And a lot of the illnesses, physical and other diseases that we suffer then, are mediated by the nature of the consciousness that we've permitted to possess us as a people. So to a great extent, the defeat of disease, the maintaining of health, must not only be pursued in terms of discovering new drugs and these kinds of things, but must involve self-discovery and self-knowledge. It goes on to state that in people with multiple personalities, there is a strong psychological separation between each sub-personality. Each will have his own name and age. Does that strike the bell? What did we say earlier? To what names do we respond? Are they the same names to which we responded prior to slavery? So in other words, as we got the new slave personality, we got what? New names. Yes, yes, yes. And we were changed. To a good extent, our names were given us to designate our new consciousness and our new situation. Each will have his own name and age, and often some specific memories and abilities. In other words, each personality has its own history, has its own biography, has its own memory. And you look at Negroes when they have a certain consciousness and look at the history they remember. Look at the things that they keep in their memories and look at the histories they study and identify with. Look at them fight African history.
All right.
Yes. Look at them want to identify with the history of Europeans. Look at them wanting to define themselves in terms of that history. And look at them having memories only for that history. Look at those Africans who are still under the possessive influence of the European implanted spirit and know that they have little or no knowledge of African history and therefore little or no knowledge of their own history as a person and an individual. So there's a consistency between the consciousness and the history that a person has and the memory that an individual has. They frequently, for example, personalities differ in handwriting, artistic talent, or even in knowledge of foreign languages. Speak a different language, depending on the personality that's in there. Multiple personalities typically develop in people who were severely and repeatedly abused as children, apparently as a means to protect themselves against the pain of abuse. Does that strike another note in you? Often only one or two of the subpersonalities will be conscious of the abuse, while the others would have no memory or experience of the pain. To a great extent, the personality of the African American today has been shaped by our desires to escape the memory of the slave experience, to deny its existence. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to come in terms with it. We don't want to re-experience it psychologically. We don't want to know about it. And therefore our lives becomes defined by eternal escape and avoidance of reality and of history and of a knowledge of who we are and how we came to be who and what we are. And consequently, we cannot act upon the reality of our history, and we guide our behavior and define ourselves in terms of a fantasy as history and a misinterpretation of reality. This is what it is. Yes. How did we get this religion we talked about earlier? I talk about Star Trek, and we talk about the time warp that Star Trek depicts quite frequently, of how people move from one state of consciousness and one world and are suddenly flipped into a new world. They go through a warp, and suddenly, all of a sudden, everything that they used to use to guide themselves no longer counts. The language that they used to speak can no longer be understood in the new world. The values that they used to guide their behavior are no longer workable. In fact, it gets them into trouble. The gods, the culture, the nature of the social relations, and all of the things that they used prior to meeting the warp no longer suffice. Now they must learn new values and new behaviors and new orientations in order to adapt themselves to the new universe that they live in. We are in that kind of position today. Think about the African in the world the African lived in prior to being brought across the oceans. Think about the gods we praised. Think about the organization of our society. Think about the languages that we spoke, the food that we ate, the dress that we wore, the music, the song, the dance, and all of those things that defined us as African people. And think how horrendous it must have been for us to be thrown into this world where there was a whole new language, a whole new social hierarchy, a whole new set of authorities, people pushing you around who you don't understand, people who are putting strange tools in your hands, people who are trying to get you to relate to them and to relate to each other in a very different kind of way from what you're used to relating to. Think about the stress and the confusion, and think about the abuse. Think about the horror of that situation our parents and great-grandparents were put in. And there was somebody that said then, if you pray to this God, if you talk this way, if you dress this way, if you relate this way, you'll get a greater sense of security. Your anxiety will be reduced. You will feel good, and you'll be able to withstand the pain of your existence. And the God then that I'm going to hand you is one that I have created for you. And a theology that comes with it is one that I have created so that you will continue to serve me as you continue to serve it. And we come to believe in the veracity of that God and that religion. Why? Because we feel so secure when we follow it. And we feel so relieved when we follow it. And yet we wonder why, despite all of our prayers, despite all of our devotion, we still suffer the way we do. I often ask the question, why is it that the people who prayed the most have the most of their children in the jails of America today? Who shout and kick over the benches and so forth, are filling up the prisons and have the children killing each other and addicted out here in these streets. There must be a problem here, ladies and gentlemen. We must reorient ourselves to our religion. We must reorient ourselves to our gods, because apparently we don't have the appropriate orientation. Because as that book you read says, you can tell a tree by what? The fruit it bears. And therefore, if it bears bitter fruit, or if it bears no fruit at all, the God you worship says it is but fit to be hewn down and thrown into the flame and consumed. Read your own Bible. It gives you a very practical measure as to whether the religion you're pursuing is an appropriate one. And that measure says, look at the fruit that it bears. And if then the kind of religion and the God you're pursuing ends up having your sons in the jails of America, and ends up maintaining African people in slavery and servitude in their own lands and everywhere, then something is wrong in terms of how we relate to that religion and that God, because the outcome is wrong, and the outcome is destructive. And it's because we don't want to confront the abuse that we went through and deal with. You see, when you go through that time warp, the only way you can ultimately come to understand the new world is to understand what happened when you went through that warp that transformed what? The personality, that made the personality what it was. And I find that interesting when further over, when I read here of what happens when the personality moves from one personality to another, when the body is possessed by one personality, and that personality is displaced, and another one comes in. It says, during the switch, there is typically a period of seconds or even minutes when heart rate, breath rate, and other physiological markers show a disorganization that is followed by a new pattern typical of the personality that is emerging. In other words, then, we go through a period of disorganization and stress, and then the personality is reorganized to fit into the new circumstances. We can't continue to pursue this, but it's interesting to look at the changes in blood pressure that each personality brings about, the other kinds of changes, physical changes that are representative of the personality. So what are we saying here then? That each personality has its own name, its own history, its own memory, biography, way of speaking, language, way of thinking, way of perceiving itself, its own vulnerabilities. Each personality generates its own life space and generates its own types of social relations. Each personality has its own tastes and appetites and its own morality. So to a great extent then, if we look at the problems and issues that confront us today as African people and see those issues in terms of the consciousness, we would recognize that we must rid ourselves of the consciousness that has been implanted in us by our European masters. One other thing I want to bring about in this situation, we notice that if you engage people in behavior therapy and you scan their brains and look at how their brains metabolize energy, there's a relationship between the areas of the brain that are rapidly using energy and the type of mental activity a person is undergoing and the type of physical behavioral activity the person is undergoing. Each personality, each type of orientation has a blueprint in the brain in terms of the various areas of the brain that are functionally relating one to the other. And it's interesting to note, for instance, that we look at something called the obsessive-compulsive personality, the person who cannot stop repeating a particular behavior, no matter how irrational it may be, the person who must wash their hands every 30 minutes, even if they are not dirty, but who are compelled to the point that they wash their hands to the point of rawness because they cannot stop, is this kind of person. The person who is absorbed by a particular type of image, by particular kinds of thought or orientation that they cannot get out of their minds. This is what we talked about. We were talking about the obsessive-compulsive personality, a rigid, repetitive personality. We note then, if you scan the brains of these personalities, that certain areas in their brain are intensely active. For instance, we talk about their frontal lobes, the so-called orbital lobe of the brain, the orbital cortex of the brain, the part of the cortex that is above the eyes, the part of the cortex that concerns itself with intentionality and purpose and direction and motivation, and the connection of that cortex to the lower brain, to the what we call the caudate nucleus, that part of the lower brain that deals with repetitive behavior, that deals with monitoring, that deals with modulating behavior, that deals with, in its connection with the hypothalamus and with the thalamus, with senses, with the distribution of the senses, and with organizing the senses. When we look then at the compulsive personality, we notice that these areas are intensely active, and active in a way that they maintain the symptoms of that personality. It has been shown then that when these people take a drug such as Prozac, the intensity of and they respond to them in a way that their symptoms are relieved. The intensity of the interaction between these three brain areas is decreased or delinked. It has also been noted then that you can put these same types of people through behavior therapy. That is, by changing the nature of the social relationship between the therapist and the patient, changing the nature of the rewards and punishments that the patient undergoes in an effort to change the patient's behavior, by changing the way the patient thinks about what is in their mind, thinks about the problems that they're in. And when you can successfully then reduce the symptoms of the compulsive disorder through this social conditioning, we note too the same kinds of physiological brain changes that occurs with the intake of the drug occurs with the intake of social training. Now, what are we saying then? Yes, that too, but what we're saying ultimately then is that the nature of the consciousness and the nature of the experience of the individual physically transforms the brain and physically transforms the way the brain operates. And therefore, when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about something that is real. We're talking about something that transforms both the psyche and the body. One of the things that you note when the individual is possessed, that the facial muscles change and that the body itself changes in a way that it literally incarnates and represents the nature of the spirit that is possessing the individual. So to a good extent, if you're in certain religions, you can tell what particular spirit is possessing the person by the very nature of the behavior that the individual is exhibiting and the very shape of their very physiological body and their face. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, once we get the spirits of these demons that the Europeans have implanted in our bodies, our faces and our bodies themselves will be transformed. To a great extent then, a lot of the way we look and a lot of the way we have organized ourselves physically is a result of the type of consciousness that we have.